Hey, everybody, and welcome to episode 3 of Shank's children's literature class. We are now into the second week of the semester, and I do realize that this week we do have a holiday. July 4th is approaching, but I'm going to go ahead and follow the procedure and follow the format and follow the syllabus, even though I realize there is a vacation day for some of you, and some of you may be having things planned and whatever for the holiday. But a summer class uh, does not stop for any holiday, particularly an online uh, class. So I'm going to go ahead and um, have a Monday video this week and also a Thursday video this week with corresponding assignments due like we did the first week of class. So I'm going to ask you to try to work around whatever plans you have for the holidays and continue our schedule for our class. Um, I'll try to keep it relatively light this week, but there will be things obviously I'm going to ask you to do, and I'll be assigning those today and explaining the assignments today that are going to be due for Wednesday at midnight. And then, of course, the Thursday video, I'll be explaining what's due over the weekend. And that's really the assignment that will probably affect or be affected by your holiday plans. But again, I'm still going to go ahead and make those assignments, and hopefully you'll be able to complete them and still enjoy your holiday and not curse my name. Um, while everybody else is having fun on the 4th, you're at home alone doing my assignments. I hope that's not the case. But I am going to continue to do the class. We're not canceling a class, so to speak, for the holiday. We're just going to continue on, and hopefully you'll be able to keep up with the schedule. Okay. A couple of things I want to do tonight. I did want to focus on mythology, which I had you read a little bit about today. So we'll be going over those notes, and also the concept of classical archetypes, which are related to and come from mythology. And I think this is particularly interesting and relevant to children's literature because even though these concepts are thousands of years old, in some cases going back to ancient times, um, they still work as storytelling devices, and we still see them um, in today's works, and particularly in today's works for children. I'm going to be focusing on, obviously, the Hunger Games as just one example of a modern day story. Actually, it's set in the not too distant future, which employs a lot of these classical archetypes that are taken from mythology. And there's no shortage of examples of other works that do that. So the Hunger Games is just one example. And I wanted to focus on that because it's really kind of the basis for a lot of modern day storytelling. And we're going to see elements of mythology play out when we get to fairy tales and folk tales as well. So at some point, we'll be discussing folk tales and how they relate to mythology. And fairy tales also borrow very heavily from classical archetypes. So they didn't lose their influence thousands of years ago. We still see them employed today in a lot of works that are geared for kids. So that's going to be our focus over the next class period or so as we use the Hunger Games for an example. And so I'm going to talk about the myth, give you some notes on the myth, and then also kind of go over some of the classical archetypes and that we see from mythology. And then your main assignment for Wednesday by midnight is to finish reading the Hunger Games. And then, among other things I'm going to ask you to do, is I'm going to ask you to see if you can identify and discuss some of the use of classical archetypes that we see in the Hunger Games. And I mentioned this, I think, in a previous video. Suzanne Collins herself has said that she borrowed very heavily from classical archetypes when she wrote the Hunger Games. So we'll be talking about that. And then I did ask you to read the first two parts of the Hunger Games for today and answer some basic questions of comprehension. A little side note about those questions, I realized some of them were kind of simple. What I usually like to do in a regular class situation is I usually assign part 1 for a Tuesday, part 2 for a Thursday, and then part 3 for the following Tuesday. And among other things we do Shank's Hunger Games, in which I quiz them in class and ask them a series of questions. Most of them comprehension like these questions are. But I have a little bit of fun with it because it's such a depressing book and it's such a scary book in many ways. We have a little contest. It's called Shank's Hunger Games. And I also throw in what I call game maker questions, questions on pop culture in the past and all kinds of questions that I always tell them I think they should know if they're about ready to graduate from college. These are questions that you should be able to know by the time you can graduate. And one example is, can you name all 4 Beatles? And I just wonder how many of you can do that. And questions like that. And actually, I don't have this at home. Obviously, I'm doing the video at home tonight. I have some in my office. But the student who ends up with the best score, we do a series of 3 quizzes, actually. And the student who ends up with the best score and navigates all the game maker questions actually wins their own Mockingjay pin. So I give out a Mockingjay pin to the winner. So unfortunately, this is one of the things we can't do online. But you can just imagine how thrilled the student is. It's like one of the highlights of their lives. And of course, they wear the Mockingjay pin every day for the rest of their lives. And when they pass on, I certainly expect that they will pass it on to a loved one as a family heirloom. Anyway, it's priceless. These Mockingjay pins are priceless. Actually, kind of like $9.95 on eBay. But anyway, so some of the questions are kind of basic, but we'll go over them. I'm going to kind of go over the answers because some of them I think are a good introduction to basic things that I wanted to make sure we covered in the Hunger Games. And then, as I said, I'm going to ask you for, before Thursday's video, to read the final part, part 3, and there will be a series of questions about that as well. And actually, I'm going to talk about the homework for Wednesday midnight in just a second. So that's kind of what's on tap for today. Let me give you our first number, 15. 15 is our first number. It's been pretty exciting here in the Shank mansion last few days. I did find a kitty. And she is, well, she's currently in the other room. They told us to, or they told me to keep her in one room at least for a few weeks so she can kind of get used to that surrounding before I open up the entire house to her. So I'm in my office here and she's in the living room. Chelsea is her name. And if you guys are really good, if you're good boys and girls, maybe at the end of class, I'll pause the video for a second and I'll go in the other room and bring her out and bring her on camera. So this will be her first, TV appearance. I think I mentioned Charlie was an old hand at this. He was a camera hog. We'll see how Chelsea looks on camera. So I'm pretty excited. I'm pretty tickled about that. It's pretty exciting having a kitty. Anyway, enough about me. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to do is, just in case you didn't get my email or weren't aware of it or didn't check this out yet, Very quickly, hold on a second. Things are never where I want them to be. Okay, maybe I'm back now. Maybe if I wore my glasses, that might help, but I'm so vain, I try not to wear my glasses. All right, so anyway, as I was saying, um, the first thing I wanted to cover real quick, just in case you weren't aware of it, I do have the presentation groups all figured out, and here they are. And I mentioned in the email, I was pretty pleased. I think everybody was able to get their first or second choice. And I think particularly important would be those of you in the picture book presentation groups. Uh, yours will be due by next Sunday by midnight. Okay. So you will be the very first group to turn in your, as I said, written presentation, and then I'll compile these four and then make them available to the rest of the students so they can read your presentations of your chosen picture book. And it will be a part of the, in this case, the midterm. Okay, so there will be a question on the presentations. So for those four students that are listed under picture books, you'll be going first. Yours will be due at the end of this week. So be working on that. And if you have any questions about that, please let me know. So these again are the different groups, and I have roughly the same number in every group. I have 5 in the last group, but 4 everywhere else. I think we're about at 17 people for the class. There's still a couple people I haven't heard from, so I'm not totally crossing off yet, but I think we're pretty much settled on the people we have in class. So there they are. And if you haven't, like I said, if you have any questions about the presentations, you might refer back to the video where I went over those. That was the very first class video that I went over. I talked about the presentations then. Or, email me if you have specific questions. If you have any question about whether, again, your work is appropriate as a picture book or whatever, that's another question you could ask, and I can answer that for you. So those are the presentation groups. All right, the next thing I wanted to share and talk about is the next homework assignment that is due this week. So again, this is Monday, the video is Monday, and then the following assignment should be due by Wednesday by midnight, and then I'll have a Thursday video. So obviously the assignment for this early part of the week is to watch this lecture. This is Monday, June 30th. Seems hard to believe we're at the end of June already, but anyway. Also, in your email where you send in the assignment, again, please take note of the numbers in the sequence. I've given you one already. Let me give you a second one now that I'm thinking about it. How about 18? 18. All right. So your assignment for the early part of the week is to finish reading The Hunger Games. That's part 3. And then there are a few articles in the Canvas that I'd like you to read, and they're all pretty much in order as we're continuing down the list. So read the article explaining and defining dystopian fiction, because that's one of the things we will talk about on Thursday, how The Hunger Games is also a really good example of dystopian fiction, which is a term that you could introduce to children at an older age. And of course, there's no shortage of great examples of dystopian fiction. And of course, again, The Hunger Games is a good one for a younger reader. Also read the article, Hunger Games Myth Connections. Also read Katniss Everdeen is My Hero. And then there's an article called 5 Lessons in Human Goodness that we can take from The Hunger Games. So read those short articles as well. And then The main assignment for Wednesday by midnight is to go to the file that's called Hunger Games Part 3 and analysis questions and answer those questions. So you will see that as well. And we might as well preview that. Okay, I did find it now here. All right, so this is the assignment that's due by Wednesday at midnight. There are some questions for the third part, the final part of the Hunger Games, just basic comprehension questions. And then here are the analysis questions. And notice I've kind of made them two separate assignments, but I think probably in Canvas, I'll probably just put it down as one 40-point assignment. The questions are worth 10 points, so answer those briefly. And then this is worth 30 points. A little bit more analysis now that you have finished reading the entire book. What do you think the age appropriateness would be for this series of books, and explain? What do you think are 4 aspects of society today that are being criticized in the novel? You will be reading about dystopian fiction, so you'll be able to answer question 3. What are at least 3 or more qualities of dystopian fiction that we can find in the novel? And I think there's plenty more than 3. If you want to give me some more for extra credit, you can. I'm going to be going over the mythological conventions and archetypes today, and I'll be very careful not to give away any answers to applying it to the Hunger Games. But I'm sure as I go through these, you'll say to yourself, boy, we see this in the Hunger Games, we see that one in the Hunger Games, or I have an example of this or that from the Hunger Games. So what are at least 5 or more mythological conventions or archetypes that can be found in the Hunger Games, and explain briefly? And then finally, like I said, the Hunger Games is certainly not the only example of this. Can you think of at least 3 other examples of works, preferably for children or young adults, that also use some of these classical archetypes? And we find them in the most unusual places sometimes. So give me an example of 3 works and list the archetype that each one uses. So some basic comprehension questions, but then these questions are, I think, the little bit more important ones, because they ask you to do some analysis and apply, the classical archetypes and conventions to the story we're reading. So that's the main homework for Wednesday by midnight. That would preview our video on Thursday. I'm currently going through your answers to the assignment that was due last night. And so I hope to have those compiled, and we'll be talking about those as well for Thursday's video. So there you go. I've read through a few of these capsule critiques that you did. A few of you turned them in early. And again, I've been very impressed with the level of quality of the answers that I've been getting in these take-home quizzes. And I think the capsule critiques will be really good to share with the whole class as well. So as those come in, I'll be compiling those. And as I said, I'll save that discussion until Thursday's video. All right, let's talk a little bit about mythology. Let me give you another number first. How about 33? 33. And I think I have everything lined up here now. Yes. I ask you to look this over for today. And, obviously, whole college classes have been devoted to mythology, and there's a whole 15 weeks might be devoted to it and explaining it. I'm going to boil it down to kind of one basic uh, brief lecture on the basics behind mythology, and so that we can apply it to the Hunger Games. And again, one of the articles in the packet deal with the value of myths. I had you look that over, so I would refer to that for even more information about mythology. The important thing to know is that back in the day, these were among the earliest examples of storytelling, and they weren't actually written down, at least not at first. They were passed down um, orally, basically. It's an oral tradition that was passed down from one generation to the next. Um, Often they were written in rhyme, because if you have a long story to tell and you have no text to refer back to or nothing to read, uh, rhyme makes it easier to remember. I think the most familiar experience that we have is with Greek mythology, but it's important to note that just about every country and area of the world have their own set of mythological stories, or kind of to preview what we're going to talk about later in the week and in the next week, they have their own folk tales, again, which borrow heavily from mythological elements. All right. So we're most familiar with the Greek mythology stories. And then when the Romans took over, they kind of stole a lot of the stories from the Greeks and just changed the names. And those are the ones that are most prominent and familiar. But again, just about every culture on the face of the planet has their own have their own myths and or folk tales that they can apply to their given experience and their region in the world. Um, One aspect of ancient Greek mythology is that they are stories that are what we call polytheistic, which means they believed in, or at least the stories indicated, more than one god. Um, and you're all familiar, I'm sure, with the Greek mythology version of Mount Olympus, where Zeus is the god of all gods. But there are a number of other gods and goddesses uh, who are each responsible for different elements that we see in our world. And so, for example, if two countries or two peoples decide to uh, commit war against one another, we say that Ares had something to do with that. If we have a um, turmoil in the ocean, a tsunami or something like that, they didn't have scientists back then or meteorologists who could actually explain what caused it. So they blame Poseidon for that. Poseidon is upset. If somebody falls in love, um, we say Aphrodite had a hand in it. So they had, in this polytheistic storytelling situation, each god and or goddess was sort of responsible in a way for all of our different human failings and uh, peccadillos. And then also they helped explain what back then, and even maybe to this day, they helped explain things that were unexplainable. Like I said, we all know now what causes a thunderstorm, for example, or what causes a tornado, um, or what causes a flood, or any other natural disaster. We've learned over the many centuries what the actual causes for those things were. But back in the day, they didn't have that information. So a common storytelling conceit would be to look to the skies, look to the gods and goddesses uh, who were responsible for those kinds of things. All right. So among the original purposes for these stories is, as I said, to help explain the unexplainable. And over the many years since, a lot of the theory behind these stories have been debunked. Obviously, we don't believe in a polytheistic system anymore. Um, we have scientific knowledge, and so we don't rely on ancient myth stories to help explain these phenomena because we know more than we did then. So back in the day, it was to help explain the unexplainable. Another purpose of these stories often was to teach a lesson. And it's our first introduction to the concept of, well, there's a moral to the story, or there's a message to the story. And again, we'll see this play out, in fairy tales and folk tales later on, and of course to this day. Oftentimes we look for a point to the story. We look for a message or a moral or a lesson, particularly in works geared for kids. So this goes all the way back to ancient mythology stories. After the hero comes back from their journey, their trek, their odyssey, what have they learned? What can the audience learn from what they've learned? What's the lesson? What's the moral of the story? And over the years, as I said, they've outlived their usefulness to try to explain certain things. But the lessons still are timeless in many of these stories. And finally, one of the reasons they've stood the test of time is because they're just so damn entertaining. I mean, the storytellers back then knew how to spin a story. And it keeps you turning the page. Or back when they were telling the stories, it kept you listening to this person who was standing up there and telling a story in rhyme that might go on for an hour or two. So they have all elements of fiction that we still love today. Most of them are very suspenseful. They're action-packed. They have a lot of romance. There's a lot of sex in these stories, a lot of violence. I mean, they have everything. And those are all qualities of storytelling that appeal to audiences. It appealed to audiences then, and it appeals to audiences now, thousands of years later. So as it says here, as I say here, the explanations are now dated and debunked, but the lessons are timeless, and they're still very entertaining. And a lot of mythological stories have been translated into stories for kids. And there are many child versions of these stories. And I had to include this. For years, when I taught this class, when I did mythology for kids, I would use the Wishbone version of the Odyssey. I don't know if Wishbone is something that was before your time, or maybe you can relate to this. There was a regular series on TV that involved Wishbone, this doggy character who would transform himself into different stories, including myths and famous other folk tales and fairy tales, et cetera, et cetera. Very, very entertaining show. And there was a series of books that did this as well. And I love this. This was a wonderful version of the Odyssey that was geared for kids. And as I just got done saying, a lot of these stories had really horrific violence in them. A lot of them had a lot of sex in them. And the Odyssey certainly did. But I love this version because it kind of downplayed all of those things and still was able to tell the story of Odysseus and all the different trials and tribulations he went through. And Wishbone is the narrator. And it was tremendously cute and very, very, like I said, a great introduction to mythology. And I would still teach it today, except it's no longer in print. But if you're interested, you can still get these on eBay and other book sites, versions of this cheap. They're all used now, like I said, because it's out of print. But I would certainly recommend that if you're looking for a really good introduction to mythology for young children, and particularly the Odyssey. I have a few copies in my office. If you'd really like a copy, let me know. I could probably send you one. Because like I said, I can't use it in class anymore because they're out of print. All right. Uh, we will talk more about the relationship between mythology and folk tales when we get to folk tales. But I think the main difference is uh, in mythology, you have like a general, this polytheistic system, as I said, in which you will have the gods and goddesses as running characters in different stories. So, for example, one hero story might have cameos by Penelope and might have cameos by Zeus, and maybe Athena will show up. Uh, the messenger god will show up. All of these different gods and goddesses. I look at it, this is kind of an old analogy, but I kind of look at the mythology stories as kind of like one big soap opera that had different subplots, and they all kind of had different stories to tell, but they all took place, under this polytheistic umbrella. So, like I said, you know, um, Poseidon might make an appearance in one story and then in another. So we're familiar with these characters as they appear in different stories. Whereas folk tales are more distinct, self-contained. And the main difference is in folk tales, obviously, you have a very distinct uh, place, a very distinct setting where these stories take place. So, whereas mythology, the setting is kind of purposely general and very vague. And in some cases, describe places that don't really exist. All right. Now, the most endearing, I think, of all the archetypes that come from mythology is the hero myth. So that's the one I wanted you to kind of focus on. And among others, Hercules is probably the most enduring one. And so I just kind of went through the different qualities and characteristics of the hero myth as shown through the Hercules story. If I were in class, there's a couple of picture books I have that I usually show to the students, and there's a really good picture book on um, Hercules, really big pictures, well illustrated, but it doesn't really translate well to online. So, among other things that are typical in a hero myth, and again, as I'm going through these, think about not only how they apply to an ancient hero like Hercules, but how they might apply to, I don't know, Katniss or Percy Jackson, or, you know what? I don't know if any of you are comic book fans, but a lot of comic book heroes, superheroes, borrow from this. A lot of superheroes like Batman and Superman, etc. Uh, the Marvel heroes, they all have origin stories. And a lot of times the origin stories of these more modern day superheroes borrow from these elements. And why? Because, like I said, they're great storytelling. It's a great way to get involved with the character and the situation. So, first of all, almost, and again, this isn't hard and fast. It isn't maybe necessarily true of every single story from myth, but it's pretty consistent. Usually, the main character, who we will end up calling a hero, is oftentimes, if not most of the time, a human. They're not immortal. They're not gods or goddesses. They're a human, often with failings and weaknesses, and they give in to temptations and they make the wrong choices and they make mistakes, and they're maybe not always likable or always do the right thing. But that makes them relatable. They're just like us. And again, that's a powerful storytelling uh, device. You got to care about the characters. So in all of these hero myths, they don't start out being superheroes who are perfect and have no flaws. That's kind of hard to relate to. But these characters will be flawed. They're just like us. But that doesn't mean they're normal or maybe common people. There's going to be something special about them. And oftentimes their story begins with some kind of unusual birth. And that's true in the case of Hercules. His father was Zeus, as I said, the king of the gods, or the god of all gods. And again, if you're familiar with your mythology, Zeus got around. He got around a lot. He would make visits to the earth and fool around with mortal women. And in this case, Alcmene uh, was the woman he had an affair with. I guess that's the polite way of saying it. And Hercules came out of this union. Another factor we often see in these stories is that they are marked. Their story is marked by something special in their childhood that makes you realize that yes, they are humans and they do have failings, but there's something very special about them too. And even in their childhood, perhaps they do something that sets them apart. And in Hercules's case, um, he was tested at a really young age, basically a baby. Um, most versions tell it this way. Hera, who was the queen of the gods, she was Zeus's wife, learned of the affair, so she wanted to kill this kid. So she sends two serpents down to kill the baby Hercules in his cradle, but he's strong enough to take on the two serpents and kills them. So it's kind of like, hey, this kid is something special. As they get older and as they reach maturity and adulthood, usually another plot device is something takes them from their home to begin their trek, their odyssey, their great adventure in life. Oftentimes, these are accompanied by a series of tasks that they must complete. And of course, this is where the adventure comes in. They get a chance to take us to all these incredibly interesting and wonderful and sometimes very scary places and all these different adventures and challenges and were action packed and violent and whatever. Um, for example, Hercules ends up in Thebes, which he defends against attack and becomes its hero, taking the king's daughter as a bride. So that's one of the first major accomplishments that he does as a adult hero. But in the course of the story, in his story, and we see this in a lot of other mythological stories, as I said, it's kind of like an umbrella. It's like one big soap opera. And the gods and goddesses are ostensibly looking down on our hero, and they follow his story or her. Although let's face it, most of the heroes in ancient myth were male. Uh, it's a nice updating that we see more and more female heroes in these stories, but back then it was mostly male. Anyway, as in Herc's story, we see this in a lot of hero stories. The gods and goddesses are looking down, and depending on their whim, they may decide to either help or hinder the hero as they continue their trek or their odyssey or their attempt to achieve the different tasks and goals that have been set upon them. And in this case, tragically, Hera, again, she's a bitch. I mean, she wants revenge against what Zeus did to her and takes it out on the child. So at one point, she puts Hercules into a fit of madness, and in this fit of madness, he unwillingly or unknowingly kills his own wife and children, and then comes out of the trance and is just mortified at what he's done. So as a result of that, to atone, so to speak, and the idea of atoning is a common element in these stories, Hercules must complete a series of tasks, each one seemingly more impossible and more dangerous than the one before. Also, just to keep things interesting, keep the plot interesting, each task may challenge our hero to show a different skill. So not every one of them will require strength. Sometimes he needs cunning. Sometimes he needs to be smart. Sometimes he needs to be fast. Sometimes he needs to know human nature. So it's not just overpowering the situation in each case, but to actually show different elements and dimensions of his skill. So in Hercules' case, and again, in most heroes' case, they have to complete a series of dangerous tasks. each one showing some heroic quality that they have. And in Hercules' case, and I won't go through all of these, but we come to know them as the 12 labors of Hercules. And each one is its own separate, exciting adventure and challenge that he has to overcome, and he eventually does. So that includes the Nemean lion, the Hydra of Lernia, et cetera, et cetera. And in the case of Hercules, and let me give you another number here, 40, number 40. I thought I'd sneak that in. Hercules is able to atone for his terrible acts and complete all of these tasks that nobody thought he ever could. And as a reward, oftentimes, first of all, the hero, through their actions, make the world a better place. And oftentimes at the end, they are rewarded in some way, certainly admired. We call their stories epics and legends, and sometimes they're even made immortal after their death. And I guess immortality is just kind of another way of saying we'll never forget them. You know, they'll live on in our memory, so that makes them immortal. So those are the basic traits of the hero myth as we see in the Hercules story. And again, Joseph Campbell, if you're really interested in mythology, he was, I think, the preeminent person who, what's the word I want? I'm losing my train of thought here. He was a preeminent expert, really, on mythology in the 20th century. And I've included in our packet some articles by Seeger and by Campbell, which kind of fill in the blanks of what I didn't really talk about here. And I ask you to read about the archetypes that we see in mythology, which I'm going to get to in just a minute. So you might ask yourself, as I went through these, how do we see these in more modern day stories? Not just literature for kids and young adults, but also, like I said, movies, TV shows, comic books, graphic novels. They endure because they work as storytelling, if for no other reason. So to get a little more specific, let's take a look at some of these classical archetypes or conventions that we see in mythology. And as we kind of review them, we can think about how, again, we see these so prevalent in so many aspects of storytelling to this day. And again, particularly for children into young adults. So, whoa. And I ask you to look this over. And Jung was the first one to apply the concept of archetype to literature. And again, Joseph Campbell, if you're really interested in pursuing an examination of mythology, that would be the person to go to. And I have compiled here from a number of different sources various lists of different types of archetypes we see in classical mythology. And as I mentioned to you, I think in another video, I compiled all these so you wouldn't have to buy a textbook of $150. So like I said, if you want to send me some money in thanks, feel free to do that. An archetype could be any number of things: an image, a theme, a symbol, an idea, etc., etc. And here are, like I said, and I'm not going to read each and every one of these, but I ask you to do this because, well, first of all, most immediately, we may see a lot of these in the Hunger Games. And I'm going to be very clever in that I'm not going to do that for you. But even as we look over the first list, which is some heroic archetypes, hero as warrior, hero as lover, hero as scapegoat, the transcendent hero, romantic Gothic hero, the proto-feminist hero, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, uh, the apocalyptic hero, the anti-hero, which is a concept I have a lot of fun with in some of my other classes. We don't really spend that much time on it in children's literature. But the anti-hero is one of the major archetypes of the 20th century into the 21st century in movies, literature, TV shows, etc. So there are a list of heroic archetypes, some of which we may see in the Hunger Games, but don't stop at that list. This list touches on the types of journeys that you can have. Every hero myth kind of involves probably some adventure, some kind of journey, some odyssey that must be done by the hero. But the motives for that, the reasons for that are different or can be different. And we talked about Hercules' motivation for what he did, but it's not always the same kind of motivation. And you see different examples of reasons why heroes will go on those journeys or treks or odyssey. Stages of a hero's journey. This somewhat reflects what I mentioned earlier, but also adds some new things. And I think, not to give too much away, but I think you can probably apply all of these to the Hunger Games in some way or another. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Here is characteristics of the hero's journey that we see from one example to the next. And they may not all have all of these, but I'm willing to bet each one has at least a few of them. So look these over. The hero has help from divine or supernatural forces. I think we see that in a lot of different stories. The hero has a loyal band of companions. I'm thinking Harry Potter might be an example of that. The hero returns to the land of his or her birth in disguise or as an unknown. We see that in the Odyssey, certainly. So look these over. And again, you may very well see some of them, not only in the Hunger Games, but maybe in some of your favorite stories of fantasy or superheroes or wherever these might apply. You have certain situational archetypes. And again, I think we've talked about a number of these already. The quest, the task, the journey. In many cases, there is some kind of initiation that must be undergone. There are certain rituals that must be performed. In many of these stories, there is a death and then a rebirth of the main character. Excuse me, I have to pause right now. I'm hearing my kitty. I need to attend to my kitty. I'll be right back. Sorry for the interruption. Chelsea was in the living room and somehow managed to get past the barricade I set up there. We're supposed to keep them in one room for a week or two, or maybe even longer, before we open up the house to them. And I've been keeping her in the living room for the past, well, I got her yesterday, and somehow she managed to get out, and I heard her kind of whimpering and whatever. So I had to go and tend to Chelsea. So excuse the interruption there. The trials of having a kitten, right? All right, we'll go back. And again, here are the different character archetypes. And boy, oh boy, I can see a lot of these in the Hunger Games. So that'll be part of your assignment for Wednesday by midnight. I'll tell you what, I'm going to throw out two that are so obvious that I don't want you to use them, but just by way of example. Certainly Haymitch is the mentor figure. They even call him their mentor, and that's where the origin of that name and concept came from. So I'll give you that one. Don't use that one. And certainly, they are star-crossed lovers. I think that phrase is even used directly. Um, and you don't get any more star-crossed than two kids who were chosen for the Hunger Games. So I'll give you those two. So don't use those in your assignment. Come up with some of these other ones. You have symbolic archetypes listed here as well. And just looking these over, I think I could pick out a few, at least a few that we see in Harry Potter. And again, especially those of you who might be presenting in the mythological presentation group, and you're doing a story of mythology or based in mythology, you might ask yourself if you see any of these in your particular story. I think, for example, I'll just throw one out just for as an example. I think you see a couple of crossroads moments in this story. Even I only ask you to read through parts 1 and 2, but I think even in the early parts, there are maybe a couple of crossroads moments, and then certainly by the end there will be a crossroad moment or two. So be on the lookout for that. I guess I'm previewing that in a way. So those are the different classical archetypes that stem from mythology that are still popular today in our storytelling. We'll specifically apply them to the Hunger Games, but then also more generally in your answers to the assignment. And I'll be sharing these as well. I'll compile your answers to these. We'll see just how widespread these archetypes are even to this day. All right, let me give you another number, 56. 56. That's our fifth number, if I'm adding it up correctly. All right, the last thing I wanted to cover was to go over the take-home quiz questions on the Hunger Games, parts 1 and 2. And again, a lot of these are basic comprehension questions just to make sure you read it. Also, this would probably be the kind of quiz I might give to the children who would be reading this book if I were teaching this book in a classroom situation. Now, obviously, we'll talk more about age appropriateness on Thursday, but it would be an older class of children, definitely. But I'll ask you to talk more about that in your answer for the assignment. But these are the kind of questions I might ask on a quiz or just as conversation points or discussion points. What you try to do as a teacher is not just give easy comprehension questions, but also questions that you think highlight some of the important things that happen in the story, so that by going over the answers to these questions, you kind of cover all the bases of things that are important. And I'm not going to ask and go over each and every one of these, but some of them I think are important to our discussion. It is the 74th Hunger Games, and she makes a point of discussing the significance of that. Really part 1 is all sort of exposition. Katniss is our narrator. And in part 1, she explains the situation. She describes her circumstances living in District 12. The games themselves don't actually begin until part 2. So you get a lot of, like I said, exposition explaining the situation. And she mentions it's the 74th. And this is significant only because, as she mentions, it's a year before the 75th Hunger Games. And every 25 years, they have what's known as a quarter quell, where they do something special to commemorate another passing of 25 years. And I'm not going to, I always have a hard time, well, not a hard time, but a challenge in teaching this book is to just kind of focus on this book and not give too much away in regards to the trilogy, the other two books that follow. So I'm going to try not to do that. But if you read the second book in the sequence, you'll find out what they do in the 75th Hunger Games. Why do they conduct the games every year? Well, there's an official answer to this, which would be, I mean, if I were to ask President Snow, why do you do this? It's horrific. Why would you come up with this game where every year you take two children from each district? And we're talking about Panem now, but it was obviously once the United States of America. So what was once the United States of America is now separated or divided into 12 districts. Yeah, why would you do such a thing? And they have an official answer, which they play in a video at every reaping, which, there was at one point a rebellion against the Capitol some 74 years prior, which was put down. And now, since then, every year they have the Hunger Games as a reminder of the Capitol's power, but also how benevolent, so to speak, they can be, because the winner, of course, of the Hunger Games is lavish with riches beyond their imaginings. So that would be the official reason. But I always like to bring up in class, and I don't know if this occurred to you or not. And again, children might not get this. Young adults might. We talk more about this in my young adult lit class. But I would venture to say the unspoken reason why they do such a horrific thing every year is, I don't know, the old standby cliche, divide and conquer. If I were the president of Panem and it's just me and a very relatively small group of individuals who control all of Panem, the capital, so to speak, we are vastly outnumbered by all the individuals in the rest of Panem, spread out over the other districts. It seems to me that one way I would stay in power or be able to maintain my power is to keep all of the other districts at war with one another, against one another, dividing them and pitting them against one another, so they would not join forces en masse to come after us, the people who have put into place this terrible system of inequality that we see in Panem. All right. So what better way to do that than every year have them offer up their children so that people in other districts can kill each other's children? And you can only imagine the level of hatred and resentment that would grow year after year amongst the different districts against one another. Meanwhile, the capital can do whatever the hell they want, and they'll remain in power, even though they're very much in the minority. So keep them divided. I always kind of use the hypothetical situation. Let's say if they were able to communicate with one another, and again, most communication between districts is cut off altogether, but let's say let's say there was an underground network where they were able to communicate with one another. And I would just imagine, let's say if somebody from, I don't know, District 5 said, we ought to stop doing this. This is terrible, what the Capitol is making us do. If we all stood up together, we could defeat it. And I could just imagine somebody from District, say, 10 saying, I'm not going to listen to that person from District 5. A few years ago, somebody from District 5, killed my little sister or killed my little brother or killed my child. I almost hate people in District 5 more than I hate the Capitol. And say that's what they want. It's kind of dictatorship 101. Keep them divided against one another so they don't come after us. So that's a little bit more sophisticated a reading that maybe children would get. But I always like to throw it out there because I think the book works on a lot of different levels. I think kids can get into it as just a great, really absorbing adventure story. But I think Collins is getting at some other deeper issues too, that the older and more mature we get, maybe the more we kind of get what she's talking about. The reaping is obviously the ceremony. And we have a twist this time around, and that Katniss is one of the rare volunteers. You can volunteer, and she volunteers in her sister's uh, stead because she knows Prim would never make it a day in the Hunger Games. The other choice, the boy choice, is of course Peeta, and they do have some connection with each other. She remembers him as the baker's son who took pity on her one day and threw a burnt loaf of bread to her while she was starving. And we also learn through subsequent chapters that he has kind of had a thing for Katniss forever, since the very first day of school. So these are the two that are chosen. And of course, their fates are now going to be forever entwined, not only in this book, but in the subsequent books. And again, I won't give anything away about the second and third book. A couple other things I think that are important. The boldest form of dissent. This happens after the people are chosen. The people are all assembled in District 12, and certainly they can't outwardly rebel, but they certainly are not supportive of what's going on. So they don't cheer and applaud and whatever. Instead, they put up the quiet, silent three-finger salute, which is, as she says, the boldest form of dissent. This is about as far as they can go. If they did anything more than this, they would probably be severely punished. But it's their way of showing support for her, but not for the games themselves and what's going on there. So a very powerful scene, a very powerful moment. Also shows that there might be some seeds of rebellion here and elsewhere that eventually may explode into fruition. And again, read books 2 and 3 for that. I think very important to our discussion of the Hunger Games as an example of mythology is number 9. And again, don't use this in your answer to the homework. But sponsors are obviously those people who are watching at home. It's watched by everybody in Panem. There's cameras everywhere, and it's shown live. So everybody's watching this. And the sponsors are those usually more well-off people who can afford to send gifts of whatever kind to the participants, to the different tributes, in the hope that it might help them in their chance for survival. And as Haymitch will eventually say, this may be one of the most, if not the most important aspects of the games, is to get people to like you who are watching at home. If they root for you, if they want you to win, then you may get gifts from sponsors, and it may help save your life. And over the course of the story, Katniss is the beneficiary of a few of these gifts, and they come in very handy. They help very much in their survival. And I won't talk too much about that yet, because that'll come up again in part 3. A couple of other sidelines. Careers are those kids who are pretty much trained since birth in the wealthier districts to participate in the Hunger Games. And not coincidentally, they tend to be the ones who win every year. Kind of shows the inequality of the system. Almost always, year after year, the richer districts, their tributes are the ones who win. The Mockingjay pin. Oh, this is an interesting question, only because it's different in the movie than it is in the book. It's one of those things that changed in the movie. If you've ever seen the movie, I think it's a pretty faithful adaptation of the book. Some things are cut and changed a little bit, but the way she gets the Mockingjay pin is different. In the movie, she goes to the Hob, the black marketplace, and she sees the pin there, and the lady says, "Go ahead and have it and take it for free." In the book, the mayor's daughter, Madge, gives it to her. And of course, it's going to become the symbol for the rebellion. She'll give it to Prim as a good luck charm. Prim will give it back to her, and she will wear it throughout the games. And the Mockingjay obviously will become, like I said, a major symbol, not only in book one, but then particularly in the second and third book. Couple of other things. Well, she's the girl on fire, and that calls attention to her right away. Kind of hints at or echoes an earlier point I made about the origins of heroes and how they set themselves apart. So I'll just let that go at that. 18, the provision she has in her pack. This also borrows from mythology. I said I wasn't going to go over these, but I'm going to give a couple. So don't use these in your answers. But always, almost always, I should say, in mythology, the hero or heroine starts out on their journey, and they don't start out empty-handed. They usually have something that they take with them, or they have with them, usually some weapon or so on. And that's true of Katniss too. She doesn't have a whole lot, but she has things like a sleeping bag and an empty water bottle and night vision goggles and a rope and iodine, all of these. And also, this is kind of a storytelling 101. If a character begins a journey with certain items, we can pretty much bet that over the course of the story, each of those items will be used in some way. Of course, her main skill is with a bow and arrow. And we see later on, maybe one of the key moments in part two, I think it's part two. Yeah, when Glimmer has the bow and arrow, but then she is attacked by the, excuse me, the Tracker Jackers and is killed. And Katniss then is able to get the bow and arrow. And of course, that's a major development because now she has the weapon which she is most skilled with. This is always a good question. I mentioned the other day, or I think I just mentioned just now. I have Shank's Hunger Games. This is usually a pretty good Shank Hunger Games question. How many die the first day? 11 die the first day. I mean, almost half die the first day. And they usually make the mistake of trying to go to the cornucopia to get some supplies. And actually, Haymitch is not a lot of help early on. In fact, the first time she asked him for advice, he says, "You want my advice? Don't stay alive. That's my advice to you." We'll talk more about Haymitch on Thursday. But one piece of advice he does give them is that first moment when you get off the block, so to speak, do not go toward the cornucopia. That's where a lot of kids get killed. Run away from it. So that was one pretty good piece of advice. Another key scene is the time when Katniss questions Peeta's loyalty to her. And what I meant by that's the time when she's up in the tree. And at this point, Peeta and a number of the careers, including Cato, have formed some kind of alliance. And so she looks down, she sees Peeta with these people and wonders what the hell's going on. And I thought I trusted him, but is he with them? And I usually take a little bit of time in class to discuss this. And what did you make of this? Why would Peeta form an alliance with them? Or maybe more importantly, why would they have him stick around? Why wouldn't they have just killed him? But the answer, I think, is pretty obvious. I think they want him around because they might be able to use him to lure Katniss out. And Katniss is their real worry. She's the adversary they're most afraid of. So I think they might be using him as a pawn. We talked about Glimmer being killed. We learn a little bit about Rue from District 11. And Rue kind of symbolizes the young innocent. She's very young. I think for Katniss, a lot of Rue reminds her of Prim. And so she befriends Rue and they form an alliance, but sadly Rue is killed. And Rue's last request to Katniss is, "Would you sing for me?" And that's a very moving moment, both in the book and then also particularly in the movie. And very interesting, I didn't ask this. Well, I guess I did. Yes, I did. I asked you, what gift did Katniss receive from Rue's district as a result of her generosity toward Rue? And then after Rue dies, she has a little bit of a memorial for her. And of course, all this is shown live on television. And in the book, excuse me. Sorry about that. I had another glitch there. Might as well give you another number while we're paused here. 77. 77. Anyway, back to what I was talking about. District 11 sends her a loaf of bread, which isn't much, but it's very, very symbolic. And again, this is the kind of thing that couldn't have made the Capitol very happy. You know, again, I just got done talking about divide and conquer and make sure the districts hate one another. Well, one district sending something to somebody from another district is not something that would make them very happy and make them very uneasy. Now, again, one of the more significant differences between the book and the movie, I don't think I'm giving away any plot points here or whatever. In the movie, it's far more dramatic than that. You see scenes of an outright revolt and rebellion in District 11, which is made up, I might also add, mostly by African Americans. And this is hinted at in the book. And anyway, so there's rebellion in the movie. And of course, it's quashed by the peacekeepers. But again, you know, signs of rebellion are beginning to sprout, and in part inspired by maybe our unwilling hero, but nonetheless inspired by Katniss and her actions. All right, and then finally, at the end of part 2, and this puts into motion everything that happens in part 3, which I won't talk about yet. The Capitol and the game makers, as we've already seen, can change things and add things and create objects and obstacles and all kinds of things. They can change the rules. They can do whatever the hell they want, basically. So at the end of part 2, they announced that there, for the first time, can be 2 winners of the Hunger Games, as long as they each come from the same district. So we'll talk more about the ramifications of that and why the Capitol would have made this change. And maybe you can answer that question already, but we'll save that for next time. And then just for fun, in the spirit of a game maker question that has absolutely nothing to do with the game, with the Hunger Games. But this was made prior, of course, to when I first got my cat. So if you picked Chelsea, you won the lottery. So that was just kind of a fun last question. All right, so those are some of the things I wanted to make sure we touched on in parts 1 and 2 from the Hunger Games. And then I'm going to ask you to read to its conclusion and its climactic moment. And then we'll talk about the things that happen in part 3, and then particularly talk about some of the analysis questions, including how the work shows mythological elements. And also, eventually, we'll talk about how it's also a great example of dystopian fiction. So anyway, so we're wrapping things up now. Just hold on one second. All right, to wrap things up, making his Zoom debut, or her Zoom. I see. I'm going to do that a lot. I had a male cat for 16 years, so making her Zoom debut is Chelsea. There she is. I know. Look at all the people out there. They stuck it out just to see you. I'm sure at some point they're thinking, "Oh, I can't stand this guy anymore," but he's going to show the cat at the end. So look at that. There you. That's a good picture of you. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So thanks, everybody. Take care. Ooh, she's starting to scratch me. Okay, so he's back in the living room. All right. Again, the assignment for Wednesday by midnight, make sure you have that. So finish reading the Hunger Games, do the questions on the Hunger Games, and also the analysis questions. Put those all together in one email, along with the sequence of numbers that I gave you, just like I've always asked you to do. And then our next video will be Thursday. All right, so thank you all, and have a good beginning of your week. And until next time, we'll see you. Thank you.